I am Sanna Kumpulainen. I come from Tampere University, Finland. It is my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, who is going to talk about taking a human-centered perspective in AI, which is a highly interesting topic to this GR community. Today's speaker is Saleema Amershi, who is the Senior Principal Research Manager at Microsoft Research, where she leads the Human AI Experiences team that is building tools for creating responsible AI experiences. She also co-chairs Microsoft's Aether working group on human AI interaction and collaboration. And the topic of her keynotes today is challenges and opportunities in responsible AI. Please, Saleema, the Zoom is yours.
Thanks so much, Sanna, and thanks for having me here. As Sanna said, my name is Saleema Amershi. I am a Senior Principal Research Manager at Microsoft Research, where I manage the HAX team, and HAX stands for Human AI Experiences. And I'm super excited to be talking to this audience today because I've personally drawn a lot of insights from the search and information retrieval community throughout my career, including recently in my work on responsible AI. And I really think there are a lot of synergies and connections between responsible AI problems and problems that the community here has dealt with regards to search and information retrieval. And so I'm going to be speaking to some of those connections today, specifically as they relate to challenges and opportunities in responsible AI. Okay, so to get started, first of all, what is all the fuss about responsible AI? This is an image that I like to show, which shows the data and AI landscape. It's published every year by First Mark Venture Capital, and it just goes to show the breadth and the reach of AI in our everyday applications, services, and industries. And now, while we know that AI and machine learning are really powerful technologies that have the potential to enhance our capabilities, improve our lives, but as AI is extending into our everyday lives, we're also starting to see more and more evidence of its potential to cause significant harm. And for this, I like to say, pick your headline, right? On the left here, you see a computer vision technology that's being used to help blind and low vision people sense who and where people are in their environment. Whereas on the right here, we see similar technology used by law enforcement officers in New York who had used an undisclosed facial recognition system to find and harass a Black Lives Matter activist named Derek Ingram that you see here. So it's this potential for harm that I think is really causing society to start demanding change and accountability. So here you see an example of an image from students in the UK protesting the use of an algorithmic grading system that was found to automatically downgrade the grades of students from state schools more so than private schools. And this was found to be due to biases in the training data. And so in my opinion, the responsible AI is really a movement that is driving change in the industry to try to ensure that our AI-based systems that we build and that we deploy in the world are safe, fair, reliable, and trustworthy. And now some of those demands are starting to get codified into laws and regulations. So here you can see some of the forthcoming laws and regulations, guidance and standard that's starting to come out. And one of the big ones here, for example, is the European Commission's Proposed AI Act. And so it's similar, I feel, to what happened a few years ago with GDPR, which, if you recall, is this general data protection regulations that came out and really caused the industry to change their practices, ensure that people had more protections and privacy in their data. And so this time around, I think a lot of companies are trying to get ahead of these and try to understand how they can address these earlier on. Unfortunately, most of the industry has reported not really being ready for this. So this is an image from a survey of over 2,700 executives from organizations around the world that have been using or deploying AI technologies. And what this figure is showing is that there's a big gap between people's concerns about AI risks and failures. So these are these blue dots on the right, and how prepared those organizations believe they are to address those risks and challenges, which are the green dots. And so it's partly, the reason for this is partly because it's difficult in a lot of cases to detect and address or anticipate the risks. And we don't have all the solutions yet in the industry. And this is a quote from this article that says, as usage has grown, so has the awareness of these risks of AI, from unintended biases to determining accountability. But what appears to have not have grown is the adoption of specific actions to help mitigate those risks. And it's partly because we're still developing these solutions. So responsible AI, in my opinion, is this movement. It's driving change in the industry, but the industry is struggling to adapt. And there's many challenges left to be solved. In the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk about why I think a human-centered approach is really needed to realize the goals of responsible AI. And I have this in quotes here because I'm going to define it. A lot of people use this to mean different things. So I'll talk about what I mean specifically. And then I'm going to talk about how operationalizing a human-centered approach when it comes to AI requires overcoming not only technical challenges, but also cultural and organizational challenges. And then finally, I'm going to draw connections between some of the key challenges that I see in responsible AI to similar problems that we see in search and information retrieval, and try to highlight some opportunities for sharing these learnings across these fields. Okay, so what is a human-centered approach? So, this term gets used a lot. It sounds warm and fuzzy, but it's also pretty nebulous, and people use it to mean different things. And so when I talk about it, I like to relate it back to its origins, human-centered design, which is really a philosophy or a way of thinking, but also a process and a set of tools and methodologies and practices for ensuring that what we build benefits people and society, and that how we build those technologies begins and ends with people in mind. Okay, so in the context of AI, this would mean that you would start by trying to gain a deep understanding of people and their needs and values and context of use, and then use that understanding to drive all of the decisions made throughout the rest of the system, including how you design the interface, the choice of models you use, how you even tune parameters, what data you collect, etc. So for example, if you are building an AI-assisted decision support system to help doctors make medical decisions, right? In this case, it might be really important that that doctor is able to see some sort of explanation to help verify whether they believe in what the AI is recommending. So in this case, first, if you understand that this is what doctors would need, it's really important to choose a model that is either interpretable or that can generate an explanation so that you can actually present that to the doctor. And this is something that you need to decide up front at the beginning, because if you don't determine this till later on, when you've already chosen your model, it can be too late and then problems can occur. Now, if we actually dive into some of the regulations that are coming out, we can see a lot of parallels to what's being asked in these regulations to what I believe human-centered design and development is really all about. So this is a section from the EU, the European Commission's AI Act. And specifically, we're looking at Title III, Section 2. And what this section says is to eliminate risk and reduce risks in AI systems shall be designed and developed in order to consider the technical knowledge, experience, education and training to be expected by the user and the environment in which the system is intended to be used. They should be designed to ensure that their operation is sufficiently transparent to enable those people to interpret the system's output and use it appropriately. To include appropriate human-machine interface tools such that people can effectively oversee the AI and enable users to fully understand an AI system's capacities and limitations, and in fact, be able to decide in any situation not to use the system at all. Right, so all of these, achieving any of these things really requires this human-centered approach, right? It requires identifying relevant users and stakeholders, deeply understanding what their needs are, what their experience is going into using a system, their education, their training, and using that to drive development decisions. Okay, so for those who are familiar with human-centered design, you might be thinking, well, great, if we need a human-centered approach, let's just use methods that we have and tools that we have for human-centered design. And there's this rich history of research and thinking in this space to do that. The problem is that, unfortunately, many of the tools and practices that we have currently for human-centered design fall short when it comes to AI. And that's because of some of AI's unique properties, like its probabilistic nature and generalization capabilities. And one designer, I think, said it best, saying, "This is the most ambiguous space I've ever worked in my years of working in design. We're literally making this up every day as we go along because there aren't any real rules and we don't have a lot of the tools." Okay, so let's take a couple of examples. The design community, for example, has decades of knowledge about how to create effective user experiences with traditional computing systems. But again, unfortunately, many of these principles fall short when it comes to AI. So, for example, there's this principle of consistency, which says that we should build our experiences to be consistent and predictable, because that not only saves people time, but it also can reduce errors. The problem is that AI systems are inherently inconsistent. And that's because AI technologies are probabilistic and can learn and change over time, which means that they may react differently to the same input after a model update or due to some personalization, or they may behave differently in very subtly different contexts. So, for example, when a speech recognition system fails due to changes or noise in the environment that a person may not even notice. In another example, we have this error prevention principle, which says careful design should prevent people from experiencing errors or from errors occurring in the first place. However, with AI, errors are inherent, and that's by design. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later in the talk. And so what that means is that we really can't prevent all errors. And this can lead to, humorous failures, like when your voice assistant puts babies on your shopping list, or, really harmful ones where people have been emotionally, physically, or economically impacted. Like in this case where we have an AI semi-autonomous vehicle, which failed to detect a fire truck that was stopped on the road, and the driver wasn't able to recover or intervene in time. Okay, so the question then becomes, how do we do human-centered design and development when it comes to AI? And this is a question that my team at Microsoft Research and many folks at Microsoft and across the industry have been studying and trying to answer in this space of responsible AI for many years now. And through my own experiences shaping our policies and practices at the company, I believe that operationalizing this approach requires overcoming challenges like cultural challenges, so shifting people's mindsets about AI, what AI is, what our responsibilities when it comes to AI. Organizational challenges, including how do we involve diverse perspectives and reprioritize our work so we can ensure our technologies are more responsible. And also technical and socio-technical challenges, including innovating in new tools and practices to empower people to actually build AI systems responsibly. And now, these challenges, they're not all mutually exclusive either, right? They're hard to separate, and they all impact how difficult it is to actually adopt these human-centered approaches. So I wanted to look at some examples of how these manifest in the industry. So we recently did a study where we asked people who build AI systems what their perceptions were about responsible AI incidents that you might hear about in the news. And in the study, we heard some interesting, but also some alarming things. So for example, when we ask AI creators about issues like this issue of Amazon's recruiting tool, which showed a bias against women, this was from several years ago, a common sentiment we heard is what we call the "this is reality" argument. And it goes something like this, where people will say things like, there are a lot of people who don't see this as a problem. The attitude is that this is actually what reality looks like. Now, this is a dangerous sentiment for various reasons, because even if there is a gender imbalance in some fields like engineering and computer science, it's actually incorrect to say that our AI models represent reality. All models, by definition, are simplifications of the world. And this is true for AI models because it's difficult, if not impossible, to really ever fully capture all the complexities of the real world. So if we look closely at this AI-assisted hiring scenario, imagine your goal is to build this classifier to distinguish between people you should hire versus people you should not hire. How you represent those people to your AI algorithm is really important. Right, so in this case, maybe you only have access to two types of information: the number of years of higher education a person has had and their previous salary. This, of course, as you can see, is a very simplified representation of people, in the sense that you're missing a lot of important factors that actually determine whether someone it would be a good candidate to hire, like their ability to collaborate or their life experiences, many of which you can't capture well, if at all, computationally. Even what the choice of information you choose to use can encode biases themselves, like previous salary, like that in itself has been shown to encode biases and perpetuate inequalities in hiring. Okay, so this is not reality, and it's important to challenge this argument, because it's this type of thinking that excuses the industry from acknowledging or taking steps to address consequences of these types of issues. Okay, another argument we heard often when in talking to people is what we call the "this is just math" argument. And it goes something like this. At the end of the day, the data is just aggregated and shown. It's not going to be wrong what they're going to see. It's still going to be right. We are not expressing opinions or anything. Okay, so again here, the idea that because it's math, it must be right is not true. And it's a dangerous sentiment, again, because it lends a false sense of credibility to potentially harmful results. Okay, so again, looking at our AI hiring scenario, AI algorithms, what they're trying to do is learn models that can generalize well to new data. And they do this while trying to optimizing some objective function. So like minimizing loss or errors on the training set. So what that means is that as models are being trained, they necessarily trade off errors and sacrifice parts of the input space. Okay, so in this case, maybe the algorithm will try this model out, in which case there are 8 errors, right? 8 misclassifications, and maybe that's a trade-off that's made. Or it will explore other models in the space. Maybe it'll explore this model, in which case this has 7 errors. And so if it's trying to optimize fewer errors, maybe it'll go for this model. So the point here is that even if algorithms are just math, the math itself is designed to do the best under the circumstances. And because we can't fully capture the real world, it's going to need to allow for some errors. Okay, so AI systems will make mistakes, and responsible AI really requires shifting mindsets so that people acknowledge that these systems can make mistakes. Because once that happens, that allows room for people to proactively address or work to mitigate harms that could be caused by such mistakes. Okay, one more example of the type of thing that we heard when talking to people is what we call the "there's no problem here" argument, which goes something like this, where people will say, the other thing to note is that there's a lot of talk about machine learning models being biased, right? Is that how you say it? So there actually is no bias in our models because it's just very analytical. Okay, so as we've already seen, biases can be encoded in our AI models and they make mistakes. But even aside from that, an issue here is the very reductive view of what an AI system is. So AI systems are made up not only of models, but also data, as we saw before, the infrastructure over which those models are running or built, and the interfaces that users will be interacting with. So even if there's no problem with the model, which likely there are, this model-centered view really prevents us from considering problems that might occur in other parts of the system that people are interacting with. And so taking a more holistic view makes room for recognizing problems throughout the system, and also for trying to include people working on these other parts of the system with more diverse perspectives to play a role in how we mitigate issues. Okay, so realizing this human-centered approach to AI really requires trying to change people's perceptions about AI. And so what that means is that we're going to try to go from what we see, the sentiment and people's perceptions that we just saw, to a different way of thinking about things. So instead of, this is reality, if we acknowledge that AI models simplify the world, that allows us to ask more human-centered questions like, how do we make responsible choices when we're representing the world? Or what are the consequences of our simplifications? Similarly, if we acknowledge that AI systems make mistakes, we can start to ask questions like, how do we anticipate and mitigate harmful mistakes? Similarly, if we acknowledge that AI systems are more than just models and take a more holistic view, then we can start to ask questions about, well, how can people who are part of the system in some sense, because they're interacting with the system and the success of the system depends on them too, we can ask questions like, are people able to safely and effectively use and interact with our AI system? Okay, so this is what I mean by why a human-centered approach is really needed to achieve some of the goals in responsible AI. But now getting to that, as you can see, as I talked about, has cultural, organizational, and technical challenges. So I think there's a lot we can do, and the field has started to make some progress. Some of what we can do is to broaden what we teach about AI. Right now, I think a lot when people or students are learning about AI in schools, there's a focus on algorithms. And in doing this, students are often given things like benchmark data sets and ready-made metrics to use. And I think what happens there is that it prevents people from learning about all the stuff that needs to happen before that, and all the stuff that happens after, like post-deployment. So for example, like learning about how difficult it is to collect data and how you often have to make simplifications can really help people understand sort of where the limitations are in an AI algorithm. Similarly, if you have experience in deploying models that you train, that can give you a sense of how people are able to interact with them or not. Another thing I think we can do, which I spoke to before, is to try to involve diverse perspectives. And this includes, extending decision-making power to people from diverse disciplines, but also diverse backgrounds, and also reprioritizing or changing how we work. We also need new tools and processes. So for example, once you involve diverse perspectives or people from diverse disciplines, the question becomes, how do you enable effective collaboration across these disciplines when people have different experiences and expertise? And so I think there's a lot of interesting challenges around creating effective boundary objects for people to communicate across disciplinary boundaries and develop AI systems more responsibly. In another example, how do you even anticipate errors effectively and efficiently when AI systems are probabilistic and they change over time? These are some of the technical and socio-technical challenges that my team has been looking at over the past few years. And we've developed some tools, which I'm not going to go into today, but as we develop these and learn about them, we're sharing them in the Hacks Toolkit, which you can go to today, and I encourage you to take a look. Okay, so this is some of what we can do, but there's a lot more that we need to do. Okay, so far I've talked about responsible AI and why I think a human-centered approach is needed to realize the goals of responsible AI. I also talked about the challenges in shifting the industry from this tech-centered approach that we take to a more human-centered approach. And I think we're making progress, but there's a lot more to do. And there are a lot of challenges, but there are a lot of exciting problems to work on. And so in the last part of my talk, I'd like to draw some connections between what I think are some of the key challenges and interesting challenges and hard ones in responsible AI today that relate to similar problems, I believe, in information retrieval. So specifically, I wanted to talk about two types of challenges. One about measurements, so measuring what matters, and the other about how do we design and development for human AI teams, including optimizing for how people interact with our AI systems. So starting with measurements, one of the key ways that we can ensure our AI technologies are responsible is to ensure that how we measure them accurately reflects what people actually care about and their needs and values. Okay, and that's because measurements drive a lot of our decisions, including whether to deploy a system, but also how we improve a system or what resources we put into fixing different types of errors. Okay, so this is a hard problem. And we see a lot of incidents where problems occur because we're not that careful in understanding people's needs and values. So for example, this was an incident where a Palestinian man was arrested when his good morning post in Arabic was translated to attack them in Hebrew. And this was on Facebook's AI-based, using Facebook's AI-based translation feature. Now, we know from Facebook's communications that at least one of the ways they were evaluating their translation algorithms was using a metric called BLEU. And BLEU is an industry standard and essentially counts the number of words that are shared across sentences without considering their meaning. But as this translation failure shows, likely what people care about and value in their translation systems is preserving meaning, right? So this is not to pick on Facebook. I mean, in fact, this example I got from this Partnership on AI's AI incident database, which has incidents like this from translation features across the industry, but also different types of AI-based failures. This just goes to show that this is there's a lot of errors that we see that are affecting people in the real world. And while in this case, we also don't even know if this incident was entirely caused by this issue, often companies will look at a lot of metrics in deciding whether to release a technology or deploy it. But our models and metrics not reflecting reality or what people care about is a known issue. So in fact, this is a graph that shows the citation counts on the y-axis by year for common metrics that are used by natural language generation systems. And this was looking at natural language systems using tasks or for tasks ranging from translation to summarization, question answering, etc. And now the blue line here represents this BLEU metric that I talked about. What's one of the earliest metrics developed. And it's one of the most commonly cited metrics in the community. And its citations are seemingly only increasing. Now, interestingly, these vertical dashed lines here are, they note some of the major criticisms that have come out about these metrics over the years and when those criticisms were reported. And one of those criticisms was that this metric doesn't capture what people actually need in their translation systems, and that this metric doesn't necessarily correlate very well with an actual translation task. Okay, yet despite these known issues, these types of metrics continue to drive advances. And I don't mean to pick on Blue here in particular. This issue goes beyond that metric, and it's a problem with these sort of standardized benchmarks and data sets and metrics. And I acknowledge that having benchmark data sets and metrics has been really useful for the field because they simplify how we measure. They're simple and efficient to compute. And because of that, they have led to a lot of rapid advancements in AI because they allow for these apples to apples comparisons between models and algorithms. But the problem happens when those metrics are used to make decisions about real technologies that people are going to use, right? Just because it's feasible and efficient to use to measure your model doesn't mean that it's valid or externally valid or represents reality. And so this mismatch between what's feasible and what's valid is a huge problem in AI and responsible AI. And I think it's one of the reasons that AI sometimes gets a bad rap. Okay, so this is where I think the industry can learn a lot from information retrieval and the rich history and advances in metrics here. So for example, how do we incentivize a rigorous science around our measurement practices, like validating our proxy metrics? What new metrics and methods can we create that are both scalable and that accurately reflect people's needs and values? And what can we learn from similar measurement problems in information retrieval? To look for another example, I think we need to do more to measure how well our AI systems are working with humans in the loop. So we do a lot of testing of our AI systems offline, and that's because it's difficult to run studies with people. There's also this misguided assumption, I believe, that putting a human in the loop is enough to compensate for AI failures. But that time and time again has shown not to be true. So for example, here on the left, you see a paper about a real phenomenon that with navigation systems that is colloquially referred to as death by GPS. And this is where people have placed too much trust in their navigation systems that has resulted in accidents or other harms being caused. And this is a thing that happens like to this day. This example on the right was something that happened just last year where people were misguided, over-trusted their navigation systems when there was a snowstorm. And despite like physical signs in the real world saying not to go down certain routes, people ignored those and went with their navigation systems. Okay, so this is an issue that of over-trusting AI systems that is referred to as over-reliance or inappropriate reliance. And it's caused by cognitive biases that people have, like automation biases or automation complacency, or having an incorrect mental model of how AI systems work. And in fact, it's been shown that improving the model's performance actually can result in worse more inappropriate reliance from people because they believe the AI system is better than it actually is. I think this is an example that is very similar to this issue of position and rank bias in search and information retrieval. So, are there things that we can learn from that? Like, can we apply similar techniques to account for cognitive biases when we're measuring the effectiveness of our AI systems? And can we apply similar techniques to detect when this might be happening, like reordering or interleaving results? I think that the community can also learn a lot from how the information retrieval community has designed interactions with people. And I think we're coming up to time, so I'll just take like another quick minute. But I think we've seen a lot of helpful patterns in search and information retrieval to help people search more effectively. So for example, this issue of over-reliance, this search, I think, handles inherently well because you see multiple options, and just showing multiple options gives people a sense that there might be more than one right answer, and therefore they should evaluate more carefully. There's also annotations that have been experimented with in search to help people interpret results better. And on the input side, like there's a lot of techniques that are used to help people retrieve better results, like helping people reformulate their queries by asking follow-up questions, suggestions, and showing related searches. And I think these similar techniques can actually be generalized to other AI scenarios. So for example, a lot of our navigation systems show multiple options, right, instead of only one. Which not only gives you a sense that there might be many correct solutions or trade-offs between solutions, but it also helps people pick the right one more efficiently. There's also, we also see this sort of disambiguation techniques that are used in other AI scenarios, like voice-based assistants that try to ask for clarification so as to prevent costly mistakes when an AI is uncertain. And so we've actually done some work on my team to try to generalize interaction patterns from domains like information retrieval and other systems, and to create a set of general patterns that we've put in this in a library that we have on the HACS toolkit. And this is to try to facilitate this knowledge sharing. And this library is meant to be extensible. And so you can actually submit your own examples and patterns and share knowledge that you have with the field. So I encourage you to do that. Okay, so with that, I'll just wrap up and say, responsible AI, in my opinion, is about ensuring that AI systems benefit people and society while minimizing harms. A human-centered approach can help, but realizing it will involve solving some really tough cultural, organizational, and technical challenges. And there's a lot that the responsible AI community, I think, that can learn from advances in information retrieval. So I hope that many of you join us and apply your expertise and skills to helping make progress in this space. So with that, thank you again for having me, and I'd love to take questions.
Thank you, Saleema. Let's all thank our speaker. Yay. Clapping. So there are lots of questions. Heather, I think you're the first.
Thank you, Sana. Saleema, that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for being with us today. I was really interested in some of the things you were talking about in the beginning and then coming back to the humans in the loop. And I've been thinking about how our mindset has been to design things that are easy to use, intuitive, and just sort of to eliminate as much challenge as possible. And it seems like what you're suggesting is sort of indicative of this idea of putting friction into the design process and kind of getting people to do more critical thinking. So do you think there's a role here for those of us who design and evaluate systems to think about how to create more tension rather than kind of focusing on this usability, efficiency, effectiveness, satisfaction as our metrics?
Mm-hmm. Definitely, and I think that this is critical. I think it's about slowing down and asking the tough questions, doing the work up front to understand what people's needs are, and talking about those when making the decisions. Like, I think responsible AI comes down to just making appropriate decisions throughout the process. And so if that requires, causing some friction, I think that's important. I also think, to acknowledge that if we want to really affect change, we have to come up with solutions that can allow for that friction, but can do so in some efficiently, right? Like, I think if we can, stop to ask those questions, but also have tools and techniques to sort of come up with solutions efficiently, that's really what's going to be needed, right? To drive change and have new practices and this human-centered approach actually be adopted in reality. But yes, I agree. I think that's a critical thing that has to happen.
Thanks, Heather. Any more questions? I did the old-fashioned that I was taking the clapping hands as a questions. So Max.
Hey, thanks for the great talk. It was really exciting. I heard someone, I think it was at the Microsoft Faculty Summit, describe working with AI as being a lot more like doing a science than being like a kind of form of engineering and building, because it was always kind of like, let's try doing this and see what happens to the system. And it was always being kind of hypothesis driven rather than rather than requirements engineering or software engineering. Like to build a system, we had to really test and play with it. I'm wondering how you feel about that statement now that you've been working in responsible AI for all this time.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it needs to be more of a science. And if we think about it as a science, then we should be thinking about what are the rigorous scientific practices that we should be adopting, right? We know, for example, that a lot of our tools don't support sort of rapid tracking of different models you might be trying. And so people adopt a lot of, ad hoc techniques to try to keep track of like different parameters they've tried, different features they've tried. And if you don't have tools to sort of support that sort of scientific process where you're iterating to try to come up with the best model, then it results in a lot of just like trial and error. And so I think there's a lot that can be done on the tooling side to support better science when it comes to building AI systems.
Yeah, really interesting. I'm looking forward to playing with this toolkit and seeing what's in there. Although I'm a novice, I'll admit. Thank you.
Thanks, Max. I think next is Jaime.
Thank you, Sana. Thank you, Saleema, for that great talk. I was wondering if you could go back to one of your slides where you showed the classification decision of who to hire, who not to hire, and the issues with representation. And I really like this slide when I was thinking about it. I mean, you mentioned, well, issues with representation, right? Making sure that you're representing the data points using the best features. And then picking a model that, this one, picking a model that achieves good classification performance on the training data. When I was looking at this, though, I thought about something, well, that I hadn't really thought much of before, but is that, for these models to work, you need positive and negative examples. And with the problem like who to hire, where do you get the negative examples, and how do you get negative examples in a way that is ethical? You see, so as a company, you have plenty of data points on correct decisions to hire somebody, but how do you get data points on what you hire people that you shouldn't hire in order to determine the characteristics of people that you shouldn't hire? And so I almost feel that there is a flaw, not a flaw, but a challenge in, how do you gather data ethically so that you have positive and negative examples? I think the positive examples are easy to come by, but the negative examples, not so much, right? The system has to make random decisions to collect feedback. Or I wonder if you can comment a little bit on that. I don't know if my question is clear.
Yeah, no, I understand. I think, so data collection in general, including collecting labels, is very challenging. In this case, my guess is, and I don't know what specifically they did, but probably I would imagine that they would use people who didn't get hired, who maybe went through the interview process and didn't get hired. But there's probably other ways you could have tried to do that, but there's the ethical questions, like how do you do that ethically? There's also like the technical challenges of collecting good quality data. And like, even for seemingly objective tasks, it can be difficult to get good quality labels. So I did a lot of work in my previous life on like interactive machine learning and tools for building AI models, and data collection was one of the things. And we see that even with like asking people, is this a cat? It seems like a really easy objective task. People like will argue and debate whether this image is a cat. You know, if it's a cartoon cat, is it a cat? You know, like people will disagree. And so there's all sorts of issues in collecting good data, doing it ethically, doing it consistently, and that's a huge area that I think we need to work on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Life is commenting to Jaime in the chat that there is another label who we should have hired but didn't, and who we hired but shouldn't have. Right. So yeah, that's a good question. Any more questions from the audience? No hands up, right? No, there is one. Melanie, please.
Hello, thank you very much for your great talk. It really amazed me. You told that reflecting people's values is very important, and I think this is very important. But I wondered what happens when it comes to conflicting values. Like, it reminded me of a recent example, like Facebook's hate speech detection algorithms, or its policy a change because of the Russian, in some countries, because of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, that some posts calling for violence against Russians invaders, or calling for death of Putin are temporarily allowed now in some countries, some posts. There are still policies, but there are, I think, conflicting values. Some people would say this is ethically right, and some would say this is ethically wrong. And I wonder, and there are a lot of other examples where you have this, and I wonder if there are tools or best practices figured out by hacks, maybe how to handle conflicting values. Or
So this is a really tough problem, and I don't have a great solution. I do think part of the solution or part of the issue is that we don't do a great job of acknowledging the values or making the values that we are optimizing for explicit. And I think that's step one, because once we think critically about what it is, what values are encoded in our decisions, then we can, not only document that and disclose things like that, but it also allows us to iterate and change those decisions when needed. So I don't have a good answer on like how you make the trade-off, but I do think it's important to think about explicitly that you are doing that, because if you don't, then then basically we're not like sort of doing our due diligence to anticipate potential problems.
thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Well, I have one, at least one. So you were talking about awareness that should be grown concerning the AI. So what do you think, is this a sort of also a literacy thing? Like I come from information studies and library and information science background, and it's a huge thing that we educate the users to be information literate. So where is the responsibility of the user, and when it's the responsibility of the system?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think this is also a great question. I think part of it is literacy, but also part of it is how we talk about AI in our media and society, right? Like a lot of times, like AI is marketed as like this magical thing, and that sets inappropriate expectations from people, right? So like how, if we're telling them that it's this magical thing, like how, we can't really, expect them to think it's going to make errors and make mistakes, right? So it's partly, literacy, and maybe like people will learn over time, just like people learned how to search. But I think it's also like we have a responsibility to talk about these appropriately, market them appropriately, and also like teach people as we go, or give people tools so that they can understand whether or not when to trust a system or not. So I think it's I think we have a responsibility to help people. And if we consider people as part of the system, like part of the team, then it really highlights that we have a responsibility to ensure that they can effectively use those systems.
Yes, and it's part of the control thing also, that who has the control over the process. Yes, thank you. Who was the next one? David, I think.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the talk, and I'm really enjoying the discussion. So just building on that, I was thinking throughout the talk that actually a solution here is to build systems that empower users. So rather than try to replace what they would do normally, so which is the case with navigation. So normally people don't try to navigate themselves. They don't use these skills that we've acquired over time, but now rely on this box. That's why they end up driving into lakes and things. And in the early days of such systems, I remember my dad ignoring the navigation. The navigation says, yeah, now turn right. And he said, no, I'm not turning right. We'll go carry on. And I think it would be better to have systems that allow a sort of sweet spot where people are pointed out landmarks or things like that, so that they can remember things or understand and make their own decisions, empowered by systems.
Yes, I completely agree. I think there is a lot to be explored in sort of how you divvy up responsibility in completing tasks between AIs and people. I think, there's work that's shown that if you allow a person to sort of answer a question themselves first, then if you show them an AI suggestion, they're less likely to over-rely because they've already done the work. It's a cognitive forcing function. They've done the work to think about the answer themselves. So they're less likely to just have these biases, automation biases. So I think like this is where it's really important to think about how people are interacting with an AI, and experiment with different ways of designing that interaction, and maybe giving more autonomy and agency to the user in that process.
Thank you.
Thank you. Peter, you're welcome.
Thanks, Anna. Hey, Saleema, thanks. Great talk. Fabulous. So great to hear this put in such a great sort of comprehensive way. I was really struck by what you said about the kind of comprehensiveness of search metrics and the evolution and the way that those metrics have been developed over many decades now. Dear to my heart, definitely. But I was curious as well because, in search, I guess we've struggled a long time with this challenge of how to think holistically about the user and effectiveness, and micro-optimizing in DCG is all very well, but it doesn't necessarily, and in fact, it can go kind of astray once you start putting systems in front of users. And I guess I was really curious to hear what you were thinking about with this notion of like evaluating a whole system in use with users, and then how that's even almost possible to feed back to the micro optimization of the sort of core AI element of that system. Because I think what you were pointing out is that AI is not sitting in isolation. It's always deployed as part of a big system involving people. So yeah, just really curious to hear what you think of that sort of downwards flow from, if we can do really great user experimentation and measurement, how do we actually feed it back to the AI learning process?
Yes. Okay. So let me unpack this question, a multi-part question. And I think you're the expert. The community is the expert in like what has been done in the metric space. I mean, in coming from the responsible AI space, I think we're sort of just at the beginning of trying to create new metrics. And maybe, as you say, like it has like, you know, this is not a solved problem, I don't think, in information retrieval, but I think there's a lot that we can learn, and there's a lot of parallels, and maybe we don't have to sort of start from scratch. And one example, I think, that is, you know, this issue of rank bias and position bias, right? And part of it is just acknowledging that that is a thing that happens. And similarly in responsible AI, that like the success or the accuracy of the team's performance is going to depend on whether the user is over relying or not, right? That they're part of the system. And so step one, you know, maybe there's much more that can be done in the metric side in search, but like I think step one is like acknowledging that this is a thing, that so that we can, you know, put it into our discussion and put it into how we might formulate our metrics. So that's one way that I think we can start to sort of think about the human in the loop and in the responsible AI scenario and account for it. I think, you know, this idea of testing with humans in the loop, I agree, is like, I mean, we do A/B testing, we deploy with people, and that's one way we can do it. But once we deploy, it's very hard to, you know, to understand how people might be. We don't have ground truth, right? We don't have necessarily when errors are happening, and that can be difficult to collect. And so one of the things, for example, my team has started to explore is like, are there ways that we can sort of simulate this human in the loop with actual people, using like crowdsourcing techniques and sequences of tasks to try to measure how people are effectively interacting with an AI system before we deploy into the real world. So I think
really
there's this open space, and I think there's just a lot we can potentially learn from each other.
Cool. Thank you so much, Saleema.
Thanks, Peter. There is one question in chat. I think this is the last one. We're running out of time. It's from Leif, again, Leif Atsapardi. He says, Saleema, I really like this space and your talks. It is worth noting that both AI and people make mistakes, and people making AI make mistakes, as it is easy to pick the extremely bad mistakes AI makes out after the fact. But how can we measure or predict those in advance? They can be black swans, swan events which occur even if we are responsibly developing AI. So I wonder where you see this in hacks AI space, what we are not measuring, but we should. So this was quite long.
Good, but it's a good question. So I think it's hard to predict what mistake might happen at any given time, but I think there are a lot of common mistakes that we know are likely to happen in any scenario. And so part of the issue is to think about how those mistakes might manifest. So like simple example of classification, you know, we know it's going to make some false positives and false negative mistakes, right, in any system. Now, how does that manifest to the user in any application scenario? And what are the costs of those different types of errors? And I think that understanding the costs, the human costs to users of different types of errors that we know will occur can help us at least try to design mitigations for people to detect or intervene when those mistakes occur. So I agree, it's hard to predict when they might happen, but we can at least sort of try to anticipate and cover our bases for the types of errors that can happen. And then I think the other question is, you know, people make mistakes as well, and I agree. And I think there's been work from folks on my team, for example, about, you know, when do you defer to a person versus an AI? There are some types of tasks or parts of the space that people might be better at solving than AIs, and vice versa. So how do you like optimize for that breakdown? And when do you resort to asking the user versus asking the machine, right? And I think there's a lot more to be explored there as well.
Thank you, Saleema. Yeah, I think Leif, thanks also. This was wonderful ending to our wonderful, amazing keynote session. Let's applaud. Thank you, Saleema. And it was very, very nice to have you here. And you hit right on the spot. This was these topics were already discussed today. So
thank you. Thanks for having me.